On the years when we were here, Jackie, you remember, Jim, you remember, where it was such an exciting time. This is where A.M.E. coined the phrase, "Come Alive, October 5." Lou Palmer was here with We Shall See in '83. We had all our rallies and things here. Dr. Coleman, you were the minister here at that time, so he was a part of it. Is Mr. Jackson here? I talked with him. Where? No, he's a member here, but he was very active, and he promised me he was going to be here today.
There he is.
Oh, wow. You're looking at different you did 35 years ago. But Bethel has a lot of history, and that's why we wanted to come here, because it's where everything happened, Jackie. Today's mission is to try to establish an intergenerational conversation. This is not anything political. It's not the endorsement of candidates talking. We want to see how we can establish intergenerational conversation, and that's what we need. We hear, we said they crazy, they say we crazy, so we want to see if we can begin conversation. But we're going to start by hearing from a former member of Mayor Harold Washington's team who painted a picture of who he was and how he governed. And I think that's important for us to learn how he governed. But in the beginning, here's Harold.
I grew up in a segregated city thinking that African Americans were never going to get the opportunity to rule and to govern. And Harold Washington changed all that forever.
Watch the city of Chicago destroyed by petty politics and bad government. I have been urged by the earnest pleas of thousands of people to enter this race. Therefore, I hereby declare my candidacy for mayor.
Earl wasn't taken seriously. None of this was taken seriously.
How are you? I don't want to be married unless you do your homework.
I wasn't getting covered outside of the African American community.
Is this high enough?
Okay, the schedule is 9 o'clock.
We did not have any money, and we were pretty low in the polls.
We have 670,000 black registered voters in this city. And we have never argued that we wanted anything short of a coalition. But when you get right down to it, the votes are here. They're here. They're here.
And push 9 for Harold Washington.
There was a groundswell, and all you had to say is Harold was coming.
Rain, snow, sleet, or shine, we're going to the polls to punch now.
You want now? You got him.
Good afternoon. My name is Carly Lewis, and today I will recite for you excerpts from Harold Washington's 1983 mayoral acceptance speech. You want Harold? Well, here's Harold. Tonight we are here to celebrate a resounding victory. We have fought a good fight. We have finished our course, and we have kept the faith. We fought that good fight. We fought it with unseasoned weapons and a phalanx of people who mostly have never been involved in a political campaign before. Today, Chicago has seen the bright daybreak for this city and for perhaps this entire country. The whole nation is watching as Chicago sent a powerful message. Out of the crucible of this city's most trying election, carried on the tide of the most massive voter turnout in Chicago's history, blacks, whites, Hispanics, Jews, Gentiles, Protestants, and Catholics of all stripes have joined hands to form a new democratic coalition and to begin in this place a new democratic movement. To those who supported me, I offer my deepest thanks. I will initiate your reforms, but I charge each and every one of you to rededicate your efforts to heal the divisions that have plagued us. Each of us must reach out in open arms. Together, we must overcome our problems and restore Chicago to its proper position as one of the most dynamic cities in all the world. To those of you, wherever you are, who have opposed this election, I assure you that I understand your needs and desires. I know I can rely on you for your assistance and cooperation. Chicago is one city. We must work as one people for our common good and common goals. Our main concern at this moment is unity. History was made tonight, and this history has been coming up on the horizon. It's been talked about in our streets, in homes, but there is nothing like victory that makes an old track man like me glad he dared to enter this race. A great adventure has begun right here. I am so proud to be a part of this great adventure. I am so humbled by the fact that you have seen fit to give me the responsibility to lead that adventure. So to all of you here, to all of you out there who worked so hard for this day, to those of you all over the country who wish us well, who sent us some of your children to work with us and pray for us. God bless you all, and thank you from the bottom of my heart.
Carla is 11 years old. Oh, wow. She's in the 5th grade, and she's a part of the Push Excel Inspirational, give me the word.
Inspirational speech program.
And Judge Hill is in charge of that program. And he just does. Oh well, okay, there's her mom. And now, Reverend Tinsley, I thought we would get this started.
Amen. Hello, everyone. My name is Reverend Jennifer Tinsley, and I'm the pastor of Bethel. Amen. And so wonderful to see all of you here today, and we're excited. We know that this church has a great history. Not only Bethel here in Chicago, but the African Methodist Episcopal Church has always been involved in the issues of social justice and the issues of the day. So we're so glad to be able to host this event today, and we're so happy to see the young people here as well. And so we want to make sure that we start off. We know that the Black church has always been connected to our history. It is the Black church that has been the support through the civil rights movement and all of the movements. It has been our anchor. So we want to just start with prayer today. So let us pray. Gracious and everlasting God, we come this day and we thank you. We thank you as we celebrate the life and the legacy of Mayor Harold Washington. But God, we come also now moving forward. God, we thank you for this opportunity for all of us to come together to dialogue and to talk. Your word tells us that you're the God of every generation, and so we thank you for this intergenerational forum. We ask that your presence would continue to be with us as we are here today. But also, God, we just ask that you would help us to stand strong against the oppression in this world today, God. In your word, God, you tell us that we should be looking at the powers that be, oh God, and to bring them down. So we come today, God, speaking truth to power. We ask, oh God, that you would empower us to continue to lift up the legacy of social justice and equality and equity in this city and in the world. We ask a special prayer now also, God, for our brothers and sisters in New Zealand who were cut down, God, because of racism and just white supremacy and oppression. So, God, we just ask that you stand strong and that you help those people as they move along. We give you the praise, we give you the honor and glory, and it is in the marvelous name of Jesus that I pray. Amen.
Good afternoon. I'm Tim Wright. I was the former Commissioner of Economic Development. I was a former second in charge to Jackie Grimshaw and a former special counsel to Mayor of Washington. But anyway, I'm going to be moderating, and my co-moderator with me today, I'll let her introduce herself, but she's also a force.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Honeycutt. I am a student at Harold Washington College, and I am the Public Relations Officer and the Secretary of the SGA, the Student Government Association.
Now, before I get started and talk about this, let me allow Josie.
Let me say this one thing. I forgot to mention that we are just excited the Harold Washington Legacy Committee because the Harold Washington City College has established a curriculum and it has already begun. And Jennifer comes from that group, and Dr. Lopez is here. Where's he's there? You are. Mm-hmm. He's the president of Harold Washington City College, and they've been so supportive in what we're doing, and we're just happy to have that relationship. Mm-hmm.
All right. Now, as we get started, let me give you a little bit of background as to how we got here today, because I didn't even know I was supposed to be here today. But here I am. That's kind of a joke, but it ain't completely a joke. You know, I got a call from Josie saying that we were putting on this event, and she wanted some ideas, and we're talking back and forth. And two ideas came to mind. One is that there was an article, WBEZ, I think an article written about the ghost of Harold Washington. And so we started talking about this ghost thing, and people don't know who Harold Washington was or why Harold Washington was important. So we thought that we should probably have that discussion, but we wouldn't want to weigh the room down with that discussion. The other thing we said is that this chasm between millennials and older warriors, I would say, we said that needs to stop. We need to begin to have some conversation about these things. So that was really the genesis of what we're trying to do this afternoon. And, you know, the program was designed for young people to participate in this intergenerational dialogue, along with those of us who've been out there. And I know what it is to be a millennial. I was a millennial when Harold first took office. James was a millennial when he first took office. We had millennials involved in this piece, but we were also involved with the folk who had been out there with Harold from day one, when he ran in '77, when he ran back in the days, and all the issues that they were trying to focus on and address. And quite frankly, a lot of those issues plague us today. And hopefully we will have some conversations about that. But we thought that the way that we would put this together is that we would bring some of the previous administration, previous members of the administration from the Harold Washington years to talk a little bit about their perspective and what they were doing and so forth and so on. And so to do that, I'll say the names, but I'll introduce them as I call them to speak. But first, we have the attorney for Harold Washington, who had been in this community. Jim Montgomery is somebody I heard about all the way in California as a consummate attorney. He was a former corporation counsel in the Washington administration. We also have Jackie Grimshaw, who was a major force in the mayoral campaign. And she went on to head intergovernmental affairs and has always been a force in life and the administration of Harold Washington. Jackie Grimshaw. When I was a second-year law student at UCLA, I used to take flybags out to meet with the firms here, and I would get out on the street selling buttons, knocking doors, whatever. Who do I meet but Jackie Grimshaw? And so, but she has been an incredible force. The other one I would introduce is Peggy Montez. Peggy headed up the Women for Washington, went on to become the chair of the city's Women's Commission, and that was established by Mayor Washington. She was a force in the community and is a force today. Peggy Montez. Now, so we can move right along, we're going to ask the panelists to speak just for a few minutes and to talk about their area and how they saw Mayor Washington. At the end of the panel, since I was also Commissioner of Economic Development, I'm going to lay out some issues that are even relevant today as it pertains to economic development in Chicago's communities and neighborhoods. And if I can, why don't we begin with Jim Montgomery?
Thank you. It is a pleasure to be here. As the former corporation counsel, I was out in the world trying lawsuits, trying to make some money, and I got a call and ended up agreeing to become the corporation counsel for the city of Chicago. Harold Washington won that election while I was absolutely, completely a pessimist. I leased a suite in the hotel just to make sure that I would be able to lament his loss with him, and sat down like most of us were shocked when they split the white vote and he won. Harold's administration was unique. I think one of his major platforms was to destroy a corrupt and a dishonest democratic machine. He did that. He was a mayor who took very carefully and very seriously open government. All of a sudden, instead of hiding our hands from people who wanted to get city reports, we agreed to those reports and entered an executive order declaring open government. The other thing that was very important in his administration, it seems to me, was that, Harold was heard to say, I didn't get to be mayor to just make a few Negroes rich. But everybody and his brother came knocking on the door looking to get something because it's our turn, right? So Bill Ware, who was a brilliant lawyer and former, I guess his administrative assistant in Washington, was very knowledgeable about the risk associated with MWBE programs and how it drew the FBI into the administration, and he was a little slow in moving in that direction. So we got so many people coming that Harold said to me one day, he said, well, hell, if he don't do it, you do it. So we had an executive order prepared creating the first MBE, WBE set-aside program for blacks and minorities, Hispanics, etc. And the program was successful. We did a lot of good in terms of getting people work who previously couldn't get work. What else? We only got 3 minutes, according to Josie. The other thing that was amazing to me was that Harold had the ability to, with that big toothy smile, to make people love him. We were out at a banquet on the northwest side in the Polish community, and as Harold sat on the dais along with Mike Royko, those women got in a line in front of Harold, and nobody wanted to talk to Morocco. So I said, this man has endeared himself to the community because one of the things that he did that was never done before was that when he expended money for public works and public resources, he spread them around to every ward in equal shares based not on your political clout, but on what your need was. So I think with that, I'm going to quit because I think that's almost 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let's hear from Jackie.
All right, thank you very much. So it's really a pleasure to be here. I always enjoy the opportunity to talk about Harold Washington. And so, you know, just to dispel the rumor, somebody said I talked Harold into running. That's not true. What I did was, Harold would call regularly from Washington and Congress, and as the whole plebiscite was going on and the urgency of people to try to get him to run, I said, Harold, why do you want to do this? You're a legislator. You're not an executive. You know how to get laws passed. You know, the most people you manage in your office is about 4 or 5. Why do you want to do this? And he said, well, somebody has to do it. And that was the end of that. And as we say, the rest was history. So in intergovernmental affairs, we had the responsibility of working with the legislative bodies. That included the city council, the General Assembly, as well as Congress. So all of the history of council wars, I think Tim and I have webs on our back still from that experience. But you know, there were 2 kinds of council fights that was going on. It was one, the big obvious one. You know, we're trying to get a budget passed. We're trying to get CDBG passed, and we're trying to deal with bond issues at O'Hare. And those folks on the 29 put their feet against the door and wouldn't open it. So we had to do a lot of internal negotiations and movement and making them understand it was in their self-interest to make this happen. And then there was the other part of the 29-21 fight that was not public. And that was the thing that those folks, those 29, would come knocking on our door, right, Tim? Saying, oh, well, you know that I know this bond council that really would like to be a part of that bond issue going on. And we'd have to say, well, that's very nice, but thank you very much. It's the competitive process. So you tell those folks to go ahead and bid and see whether or not they can become the bond counsel for the various deals we had. So there were those 2 kinds of operations that was going on, the public and then the private. So in spite of those folks trying to act like they hated us, you know, they understood that we had the power and they had to bend, so to speak, to the power. But then there were also the other things, like being in Congress. The department heads, in fact, all of our legislative agenda really came from the department heads. And so we would have a process of gathering up what are the priorities for the various departments, and then we would go and sift through them, and Harold would make the final decisions about what bills we would support in Springfield or what initiatives we wanted to get introduced into Congress. And so going to the Congress, you published a federal agenda. And at the time, the head of the Illinois delegation in Congress was Dan Rouse-Sankowski. And so Dan would gather all of the Illinois delegation from Chicago down to Cairo, and we would meet together. We would have lunch. Harold would talk about what the city was up to, what the city's priorities, and what he needed from them in Congress. And we got that cooperation. We did get the support for the city's agenda in Washington, as well as in Springfield. You know, when I first went into intergovernmental affairs, Tom Coffey was the director, and I was a deputy. And Tom left, and Harold wanted me to become the deputy. But the folks around the table, I don't know, Jim, if you were of that opinion or not, they kept saying, hey, Michael Madigan, he's never worked with a woman. You think Michael Madigan's gonna deal with a woman that's head of government affairs? And there was this discussion and wondering. I said, Harold, I'm gonna go call Mike, which I did. And I said, Speaker, Harold wants me to take over for Tom as Director of Intergovernmental Affairs. Do you have a problem with that? And he said, of course not. So that's how I became the director of intergovernmental affairs. So that's, you know, presumption sometimes. And we were breaking ground. I mean, we were cracking all kinds of ceilings in terms of African American leadership with a corporation counsel like Jim, but also in terms of female. And so I've probably done 3 minutes, so I'm going to turn it over to Peggy so she can talk about Harold's commitment to women in his administration.
Great, thank you. And Peggy.
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you very much. Hey, Tim. Hey, Jim. Hey, Joseph. Hey, Lucille. Hey, a lot of you. I am here because Harold kept his promise to women. If it had not been for the women, and I still make that a fact, that is true, Harold never would have become the mayor. It is because of the women who got out there and thank you. It is because of the women through our Women's Network for Harold Washington, where we had the goal of trying to reach more than 10,000 women in the city of Chicago. And we had to meet that goal within 2.5 months. And we were very successful. We started at the end of December, and by February we had reached that goal. February was the primary, and Harold won that election. We did it in terms of initiating our pyramid of 1 by 10, by 10, by 100, by 1,000, and we got to our 10,000. Now, because Harold won the election did not mean that his job was going to be over. Our desire was to improve equality and parity within city government. We wanted to see women in administrative positions, not just in those positions where they were secretaries, but we wanted to see women in positions where they would make decisions. That is why I printed up this Women in Chicago Government Bulletin. This was something that we passed out so that you could take a look at the number of women that Harold brought into his administration that had never been there before. Not only that, when Jim talked about contracts, we decided also, you left out about the women and their quota. That's right. And so we were determined that because we understood contracts, the importance of contracts, that women needed to be guaranteed a certain quota. And believe it or not, it was just a minimal quota of 5%, but believe it or not, 30 years later, it is still there. So no progress has been made. Also, we looked at what needed to happen within hiring of women in different non-traditional jobs. Did you know we have so many bridges in the city of Chicago? We have bridge tenders. We had never had, I think there was only one female bridge tender, but we were able to go into that department and we ended up with many more bridge tenders. And just think, all they had to do was sit there and as the boats and ships came by, raise the lever and then let them down, but they made a lot of money. Also, in terms of the fire department, we only had maybe like 6 women who were fire persons when Harold became the mayor. But we looked at what was going on. Well, what was going on, the women could pass the written examination, but they could not pass the physical examination, simply because their upper body strength was not developed. We set up a program with the University of Illinois, and we brought those women in who had successfully passed the written part, and we helped train them to develop their upper body strength. On that third poster over there, right in front of you, Ken, would you go there and show them the third poster and show it around? There you see the first graduating class of the female firefighters that Harold had increased by almost 100%. Now, being a teacher means that I document. And so that means you need to look at my attic, you need to look at all the boxes that I have, so that at any minute I can bring out all this information. Not only were we successful in terms of hiring women in the different departments. But like I said, Harold created women administrators in departments that they had never been before. Now also something else, you know, we're talking about women and sexual assault and sexual abuse. At that time, when women were raped and they went to the police departments, there was no empathy, and that's exactly the word. And so what we did in working with the police department, we worked with the hospitals to set up the rape kits so that the women would at least have justification in terms of what had happened to them. Harold did so many fantastic things, and like that song says, there will never, never be another Harold Washington. I am so happy. I am so happy that I was a part, and I still miss his wonderful smile. In terms of when it was very infectious, because when he smiled at you, then you knew that all you could do was the right thing, and especially for the women. The one thing that I admired about Harold, he did not tell me anything in terms of what I could not do. Because I was a member of the cabinet, he told the head people, departments, that when Peggy makes an appointment with you, keep it and work with her. We also set up affirmative action. There were so many things that we did, but I'm getting 20. Bye.
Thank you, Peggy. I'm going to turn it over to your moderator, Tim Wright.
Both candidates were invited, and delighted to see that Tony Predwinkle came. And the role for the candidates was to be, and Tony, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think this is the only forum that has had the young generation involved to talk with the candidates. So the idea is for the young people to interact with the candidate.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you, Josie. And with that, I'm actually going to advocate and turn this portion over of the program over to Hermine Hartman so that she can introduce the candidate and we can engage in these discussions with our millennial panel.
This is it's really a historic day. So, yes, I want to introduce the panelists. Mr. Kofi Ademola. He is an activist. And then we have Ms. Taylor Norwood of the Good Kids Mad City. That's all of us. And then we have Mr. Jamal Green, who was a mayoral candidate. We have Chantel Grant from Level Update. And we have Justina Winfrey. Okay, so we're going to start with Mr. Give him a round of applause. We want to thank you for being with us. And we're going to take our first question from Ms. Winfrey. You take the microphone, please.
If you are elected mayor, would you be willing to audit the land records in the city of Chicago?
Audit the land records? Tell me what you mean.
Well, we do know that based on research, there are major improprieties and issues with the tax ID numbers with many of the properties on, let's say, Jackson and Cicero on the west side of Chicago, for example, where homeowners have been pushed out as a result of their tax ID numbers being changed, unfortunately, and their taxes being sold. As mayor, would you be willing to audit the land records in the city of Chicago, particularly the tax ID numbers, the parcel index numbers?
This sounds like a challenge that is a joint issue for both the city and the county.
Absolutely.
Because the county keeps all of the tax records and assesses the properties and collects the taxes. So I'd be happy to work with county elected officials to address the challenge that you've suggested. Now, auditing every single parcel, of which there are hundreds of thousands, is going to be difficult. If you have some particular parts of the city which you know are challenged, that would be the place to begin the work.
Thank you.
Mrs. Norwood, would you take a question, please?
So my question is, if you are elected mayor of Chicago, in your own idea, I guess, what would your campaign look like for Black and brown youth on the south and west sides of Chicago?
Well, whenever I talk about the challenges the city faces, I begin with education. You know, you can pretty much predict the performance level of our public schools by zip code. Those public schools in our most privileged communities are the highest performing. And so we need to invest in all of our schools so that every young person has access to a great education. And that means we need to change the formula for allocating resources, which presently is a per pupil basis. And we need to factor in the needs of the community, because some communities need bilingual support. Many of our communities need social workers and psychologists, and those are additional professional personnel that will enable the young people in those schools to succeed. So one of the first things is looking at our public education system and changing the way in which resources get allocated to our public schools. As you're probably aware, there's a lot of attention that's been put over the last decade into our magnet schools and selective enrollment schools and charter schools. But it's really our neighborhood public schools that are the backbone of our community. You know, and we have to invest in them, and we have to see that our school system is investing in them if we're going to have equal access to education. So that the first challenge, I think, is resources allocated to our neighborhood public schools.
Mr. Coffey, take your question, please.
First of all, good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Can I get permission from my elders to speak? Yes. Ashe. So, disclaimer, I am not a millennial. I'm a little bit older. I like to call myself a baby elder for my young folks. So back in 2012, so I live in the Woodlawn community. Back in 2012, hey, what's up? I was a part of the fight to keep the mental health clinics open. I stood out with the community, especially the one right on 64th and Woodlawn. You know, that was a heartbreaking fight as we saw ROM close the mental health clinics and the over 50 schools. So I guess my question would be centered around first responder care. Well, first reopening mental health clinics and getting more trauma-informed schools and therapists inside schools. But my question more so is around first responder care. We've seen too many unfortunate occasions, like in the case of Betty Jones and Quintonio LeGrier, where people with guns, aka the police, show up when someone is having a mental health crisis. And I'm curious to know, you know, if your administration will have a plan to make sure that first responder care is given to folks going through mental health crisis where the intervention isn't police or the criminal justice system, along with our young people. What's going to be the plan to ensure people's safety so that they are not harmed or they're not harming themselves in that type of scenario?
Well, first, thank you for your question. When I left as an alderman, I think there were 12 mental health clinics and 7 got closed, more than half. Is that right? I think that's right. And let me just tell you what happened. The county provides health care through our health and hospital system, and of course we run the courts and the jails. And so when people did not have access to health care, to meds, and to therapy, you know, we basically saw an uptick in the number of people in our emergency room in crisis, and more people in our criminal justice system as a result of acting out, right? So, you know, I think this was sold to the people of the city as cost saving, but it was really cost shifting. It shifted the cost to the healthcare system and to the criminal justice system. And, you know, also, I think it's one of the contributing factors to the homelessness crisis. I mean, so we have to go back and revisit the closing of clinics and figure out which ones we can open. As the clinics closed, some community-based organizations stepped up to try to fill the gaps, and of course, our health and hospital system, through our county care program, provides behavioral health services. And so when we put the program in place in 2013, the county really hadn't had a behavioral health footprint, but we added that to the services that we would provide our patients, and so we kind of stepped up in that arena. But we've got to look at closing the closure of the clinics and revisit that and figure out how we can open them, or frankly, step up our support to the community-based organizations that stepped in so they can really do the work. You know that the Department of Justice was very critical of our police department around training issues. And one of the things that all of our police officers need to be trained in is crisis intervention. It's called CIT, crisis intervention training, and that hasn't been provided to all of our officers. So that's one thing. That's a gap that we need to address. That will help officers address domestic situations and situations where an individual is in a mental health crisis. But let me talk about a third point, which we don't often address, and that is services for our first responders, particularly our police officers. In the last 6 months, 7 officers have committed suicide. And we have to create an environment in the police department where people have permission and are encouraged to get support. Because being a police officer is a very difficult job. And if you can just imagine the violence and the deaths that police officers have to deal with, it's very troubling, and there hasn't been a culture in the police department where people are encouraged to get help. It's been seen, frankly, as a sign of weakness, and that's a real challenge. So, you know, opening the clinics and or supporting the community-based organizations that have stepped up, changing the training regimen to be sure that every officer has crisis intervention training and, frankly, use of force training. I talked to a high-ranking police officer in the last month who said that he hadn't had use of force training since he was in the academy, and he'd been in the police department for decades. So refreshers on use of force training, and then basically building up, I think they're called EAP, employee assistance programs, to address the trauma that police officers suffer as they struggle with the violence so many of our communities address. We need programs to address the violence in terms of trauma in the neighborhoods, and you should know that Senator Kwame Raoul has been, former senator and now Attorney General Kwame Raoul, has been a real advocate for using our federal support for victims of violence for trauma in our communities. So it wouldn't be just people who were victims of domestic violence, for example, but residents of communities in which there is high proportion of violence getting trauma-infused care.
Mr. Jamal Green, next question, please.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
This looked like the mic that Mayor Washington was using when he was announcing. It is. It's the one? Good, good, good. I can get some good luck off of it. First, thank you to Madam President for coming today. So my question would be, what we saw with Rahm Emanuel's administration is a lot of the people that were connected to communities were on the outside fighting City Hall. There weren't many people inside of City Hall connected to the communities, and it was just a big divide, many protests, and challenging, the fifth floor's power. So if you are the mayor, we talked about Mayor Washington's appointments, how will you appoint those who are connected to communities, as well as far as millennials go, as far as those who are in advocacy groups, to key positions in the administration to help you shape the city for the future?
Great question.
Well, I think that's critical. You want as many constituencies as possible represented in your administration. I've always said government ought to be reflective of the people that it serves, and that's about geography, it's about race, it's about gender, it's about ethnicity. So I think there has to be careful thought given to that, and to try to be sure that government is as representative as possible. I had a number of conversations this past week with West Side elected officials, and one of the things that they were very concerned about was that West Siders are not, they believe, represented on boards and commissions and in government in the way that other communities in the city are, and that leads to a insensitivity, if not neglect, of the West Side. So that's just one example, but I think government has to, as I said, has to be as inclusive and diverse as possible. That's surely been my position as a committeeman, to try to be sure that we support very diverse slates in the county of folks, and we have been doing that, frankly, for the last several years, but before that it was a real challenge. So I think government has to be reflective of the constituents they serve. Therefore, you make an effort to be sure that you're being as inclusive as possible.
Chantel?
Hello, everyone. May I have permission for my elders to speak?
Yes, of course.
Okay. Thank you, Madam President. I want to first and foremost, thank you, Mama Josie, for allowing me to be here, and my mentor, Regan Fellows, as well. I want to ask you, Madam President, in terms of the Black Agenda, which is adopted by the National Black Agenda Consortium, and it's a coalition. It's full of a coalition of the Harold Washington Legacy Committee and other groups like 10 by 10, New Black Leadership, and so forth. I want to know, what are your plans to implement the economic portion within the city of Chicago so young people can have jobs and can use their entrepreneur spirit to be able to create wealth in the city of Chicago, from the city of Chicago?
Sure. Our neighborhood small and medium-sized businesses are the backbones of the community. They're much more likely to employ neighborhood residents than the chains or whatever that come in. So we really have to figure out how to support them. There's something called the Chicago Micro Loan Institute that gives small loans to businesses. I think it's like $500,000 to $50,000 to neighborhood businesses to help them start or build or sustain their business. There's also the Neighborhood Opportunity Fund, which is presently a rebate program and needs to be a grant program, because if you don't have access to capital, it doesn't help you to have it rebated to you after you've put it out. You need it in the first place. So those are two examples of ways in which we try to support the small business community. But I think, we also have to build back our neighborhoods. As when I was alderman, one of the things that was said was, when we tried to talk to national chains to come in the communities, they would say you don't have enough rooftops. So we did a lot of work on affordable housing developments. Actually, we built 1,500 units of housing when I was alderman. We did a lot of work on affordable housing developments. Willard Square, Hearts United, CHA transformation developments on Lake Park, on Drexel Boulevard, and of course Oakwood Shores, which was Ida B. Wells. So one of the ways in which to support your business community is to bring in new housing. And in many of our communities on the south and west side, there's a lot of vacant land, and we need to do everything we can to encourage development of those properties so that we can build up the population and support the idea that businesses will have an opportunity to thrive in those neighborhoods.
So let me ask you a question. When you say there weren't enough, some of these people say developers, not developers, but companies coming in, there are not enough rooftops. That means we don't have enough density?
Yes, that was
population density?
That was their point. Okay. And, when I became alderman of the 4th Ward in 1991, there were 3,000 city-owned vacant lots in my ward, and that didn't count the privately held ones. So there are very large numbers of vacant lots, and frankly, that enabled us to do a lot of building of affordable housing without without the threat of gentrification, because there was just nothing there. So.
In the first place. Okay, let's have round two of...
yes, Tim Wright at the time was at the Department of Economic Development, I think. Yes, that's right.
So, and in city government, Tony, you were in city government under Harold Washington's administration. You were in economic development, is it?
I was in Tim's department, yes. He was commissioner during the time that I was there. I spent 3 years. I spent 3 years as a staff member in the Department of Economic Development under Harold Washington. Yeah.
It's important to note. Okay, so Coffee, let's start with you with round two of our questions, please.
So I appreciate that the conversation of economic development came up. That was a great question. So to continue in that spirit, I work in, I community organize in a couple of neighborhoods, and when I talk to the young guys on the block, a lot of the conversations are, you know, not only do they want to find out how they can get into the workforce, but they want to know how they can become entrepreneurs, how they can, you know, create businesses on their own. So then I give them this crazy idea of like socialism and cooperative economics, and they're like, what? Whoa, what's that? Right? But my point being is this idea of having cooperative owned businesses to then, you know, have community revitalization to get that dollar flowing back into the neighborhoods. So one platform that I liked from A.M.E was her platform around having a public bank, but also having like micro investments into to neighborhoods. So again, with your administration, would you entertain the idea of helping to support startup businesses, but also having, you know, training so, you know, people who aren't coming from sort of the middle class, collegiate level, academic level, have an opportunity to have investment and get into the market, but also to, again, develop more cooperative businesses and sort of tech businesses that will stimulate the growth in the economic development and traditionally neglected communities on the South and West Side.
The answer is, of course. I mean, when I talked earlier about the Chicago Micro Loan Institute, that's exactly what they do. They give very modest amounts to businesses to help them start up or reach the next level. And again, the Neighborhood Opportunity Fund provides larger sums to firms. And, you know, I think both of those tools are ones that we ought to use. Business Affairs and Consumer Protection has to take a more active role in providing capacity building opportunities for neighborhood businesses too.
Ms. Norwood, next question.
So my question is, as a member of Good Kids Mad City myself and some of our other organizers have worked with different groups like No Cop Academy. Earlier I asked you a question about your investment in Black and brown youth on the south and west sides of Chicago. And it's been reported citywide, there's been a citywide disapproval of the $95 million Cop Academy, whose price seems to keep rising. But more importantly, in West Garfield, it's been reported that the surrounding community would rather their $95 million be invested right back into their community in things such as schools and mental health clinics and grocery stores and other resources and job opportunities. And my question is, what is your position on the Cop Academy? And if you are elected mayor of Chicago, would you put a halt on any further progress of the Cop Academy? And if you can, would you put a portion of that money back into the community so that it would benefit the surrounding community directly?
I had a difficult discussion with West Side elected officials in which I reiterated my position is that we shouldn't have the Cop Academy, that it was, we need a training facility, but not to spend $95 million in that way. There are elected officials on the West Side who see that as a good investment in their community. And what I said is exactly what your point is. We need to invest in this community, but it needs to be in affordable housing. It needs to be to support the business community. Those are better investments of tens of millions of dollars than the Cop Academy. So that's been my position from the very beginning.
So since that has been approved by City Council as of last week, does that mean under your administration it must go through, or can it be prevented?
You know, frankly, I'll have to see. You know, I'm not sure that there would be the votes in a new city council to overturn it, and that's the first thing you have to decide. You can propose things as the executive. You have to get support for them from the legislative body. So, I mean, that's where it would go. What's the feeling of the legislative body about this, and is there an opportunity to overturn it and try to invest the money in different ways?
Chantel Grant, next question, please.
Thank you. Madam President, in terms of creating wealth, we know that majority of wealth is created through real estate. On the South, considering that the South and West sides are deeply, what's the word? Blighted. And what happens is that majority of developers come into the South and West side that are not in the community, and they create wealth off the backs of our community. What are your plans as far as keeping those that are in the community, that may be developers or in real estate, to be able to create wealth within their own communities as well?
Cook County created a land bank, the Cook County Land Bank, to receive foreclosed properties from the banks. They go into the tax sale and buy vacant land. And they have, I think, a very good record of using neighborhood entrepreneurs to redevelop the properties that are in the land bank. And they've done that all over the city and all over the county. So I would continue to invest in the land bank and the good work they're doing with the smaller developers, giving them an opportunity to take a home or two, to renovate it, and then to put it on the market for sale and increase both opportunities for them as entrepreneurs and home ownership.
Mr. Green, next question.
So as far as I want to jump back to, we talked about policing, and the police academy is, of course, we all know, not a good investment. We're not going to get it back in jobs. We're not going to get it back in anyone want to even surround the police academy. But as far as policing goes, one of my big ideas when I was running for mayor that caught fire was in regards to the police misconduct settlements. Last year, we spent $113 million just on police misconduct settlements in 2018. And so when you talk about over the past decade to 15 years, you're talking about $1 billion in settlements and legal fees and things of that sort. When we're looking at the budget, you know, we're talking about the funds that we can use for different things. $113 million in 2018 is just going to families that have been abused by police. Could have went to open up all of the mental health facilities and done 10 times more than that. So my idea was to have insurance on police officers to allow them to assess the liability of police, and if they didn't, if they were a risk, then they wouldn't be able to patrol the streets of Chicago. What is your idea going into the administration to save the $100+ million that we're spending each year on police misconduct settlements?
Well, I think the first thing to understand is that if you train the police officers better, crisis intervention, use of force, and you insist that we no longer tolerate a code of silence in the police department, and that you acknowledge that there's racism in the police department, that you work to change the culture in the police department, that has an impact over time. But there are a number of these cases that are already in the pipeline, and so you can't, you know, the bad acts that have already occurred, right? So you can do things going forward, but you're going to have to, frankly, settle with those families that were abused by the police, you know, over the last 5 years that are moving through the courts, right?
Pending cases.
Yeah, exactly. There are all these pending cases. So you can do things right now to change the way police officers act, to try to change the culture in the police department, but you still got all these pending cases which will come before the city council eventually. So that's one thing that I think we have to understand. I've said we need to invest more in our police officers, invest more in their training, invest in better supervision. You may know that the best practice is there's one sergeant for every 8 officers on the street. That's a good supervisory ratio. But in some of our districts, we have one officer, one sergeant for every 30 officers on the street. So people are not being properly supervised. We haven't invested appropriately in their training. We haven't invested in their supervision. We haven't held them accountable for performance. The statistic I always cite is that nationally, out of every 100 murders, a person is arrested in 62 or 63 of the cases, so 62, 63%. But in the city of Chicago, for every 100 murders, there's only an arrest in 15% of the cases. So we have to hold our police accountable for performing in the most serious crimes that are committed, that is our murders and shootings. And by the way, a person is arrested in a shooting in less than 10% of the cases. And what that does is contribute to violence in our communities. Because if you know, as people on the street know, that whoever shot and killed your brother or your uncle or whoever is unlikely to ever be brought to justice, the temptation, of course, is for you to go out and seek revenge and retaliation, and that just leads to more violence, right? So that's the real challenge.
The quick follow-up, the city has insurance that says that the insurance will only pay out settlements that are $15 million or over. Would you look at some mechanism to take the liability off the city from these settlements? That's what I'm asking. Another way that, we're not spending this amount of money.
We can do this kind of insurance, but I think the best solution long-term is to change the culture in the police department and improve the training of our officers. And let me just say, when those 3 officers were acquitted of covering up Laquan McDonald's murder, there was an officer from the Latinx community who testified against them. What's her life going to be like in the police department after those guys were acquitted? What's her life going to be like?
Hell ho. Ms. Winfrey, last question, please.
Okay, so I actually have 2 statements and a question. Regarding the Cook County Land Bank that allows developers to purchase properties in bulk, it actually keeps regular citizens like all of us from being able to purchase those properties. And I have a nonprofit organization too, as several of the millennials up here do too, and zennials. The big issue that we ran into back in 2014 that I actually called to the forefront with the African American Family Commission was that we could not continue to allow people from the outside. The executive director from the Cook County Land Bank is a developer from Texas, which means that ultimately we are still being kept out of being able to purchase these properties through the standard procedures that we were told just to go online, fill out the application. However, you have organizations that are purchasing these properties in bulk, 20 properties at a time. And it's not okay, and we've had a problem with this since 2014. So recently, we also proposed House Bill 5965, which would amend the Abandoned Housing Rehabilitation Act and permit an organization that files a petition for temporary possession of a property to also request a court order waiving or extinguishing any county property tax lien or unpaid property taxes existing on the property if the property has been vacant for at least 3 years. We received a very nasty response from the executive director, Brother Rob Rose. Would you be willing to pass an ordinance to work with organizations to acquire those properties that have been vacant and abandoned for 3 years?
Well, first let me say, I know that not all the sales are bulk because I've met some of the developers who've done 1 or 2 houses. So there may be bulk sales, but there are also sales of individual properties to developers, and individuals have the opportunity to rehab homes. So I've met those folks. I don't know anything about House Bill 5965, so I think it's unwise for me to comment. But, I'd be happy to talk to you after this or give you the contact information so I can get back to you. My view of the land bank is more positive than yours. I will just say that I've seen the work that they've done and the opportunities they've given to individual developers, many of whom I've met, who either this was their first home or their first opportunity to do development, and who were able to establish careers in real estate as a result.
The second part was regarding the No Cop Academy. Many are not aware, and I have 5 years vested at McPier Metropolitan Pier and Exposition Authority. McPier has a $40 million state-of-the-art command center in the North Building that has direct access to every single authority, from the police to the military. Why not have the training for the police as opposed to the $95 million academy out of McPier? We don't always have events going on at McCormick Place. We have a beautiful hotel there where we can house the police there at times. We have a huge facility where we could set up space and section off space to accommodate police training. We have a $40 million state-of-the-art command center that has already been paid for. Our tax dollars have already paid for this.
So you want to look at that as an alternative?
Yes. The actual question was, under the Harold Washington administration, and I'm not sure if you all are familiar, but I was a part of Youth Communication Chicago, the first youth media outlet in the nation. This particular organization was a part of the Harold Washington administration, where the youth were a part of the city council, where they had the opportunity of civic engagement on a regular basis, where each youth from the ward from particular high schools were allowed the opportunity to come in and mirror and be mentored by city council members. Would you be willing to open and fund a program for our youth so that they can understand government? Because we understand that political scientists and economists run the country.
Good point.
There's presently a not-for-profit organization which you may be aware of called the MCFA Challenge, which does a lot of that civic engagement work, and which I've worked with for a very long time. And that organization encourages young people to be involved in political campaigns, to be involved in government. And although I'm not familiar with the specific work that was done in the Harold Washington administration around youth engagement, because I was in the Department of Economic Development, but it's something I'd be happy to try to work on.
So now let me take some moderator privilege, okay? And let me go through some firebrand questioning. For the Chicago Public Schools, what is your thoughts on an elected school board council?
I have been quite public about the need for an elected school board. We're the only district in the state that doesn't have an elected school board.
So you're in favor?
That's correct.
Okay, and for the 50 schools that Mayor Rahm Emanuel closed, what would you do with them?
Well, my understanding is that of the 50 schools, 38 of them are still vacant. Mm-hmm. And so it's a matter of working with the local elected officials, that is the aldermen and the community, to try to figure out what's the appropriate reuse or rehabilitation or reutilization of the schools. And I think that has to be done on a community basis, because in many of our communities there's more than one school that's been closed. And you want to do something that you want to reuse the schools in a complementary way.
Okay. We just saw, I think again this week, Lincoln Yards was approved. Would you approve that, or would you try to disregard that as mayor?
Well, again, it was approved. I expressed my concern about moving these big projects forward before the new mayor came in. My understanding is that the TIF allocation of the project is almost $1 billion, $900 million. Mm-hmm. This is a part of the city in which the real estate market is very robust, and what I said at the time was, it's unclear to me that we need a $900 million subsidy for this project for it to go forward. Right. That we need to look very carefully at, I mean, sometimes you need TIF support for infrastructure, so you're going to build sewers and water mains and whatever where there weren't any before. And sometimes these TIFs are just subsidies to the developer. So the question is, you've got to look at what's proposed in the redevelopment agreement to see if there are expenses that make sense and which ones don't. But I had said that I was opposed to moving it forward in advance of the new city council and the new mayor.
Next question is, Mr. Montgomery spoke about putting in place under the Harold Washington administration affirmative action, where blacks, women, minorities were kind of opened up to opportunities in city government. Would you enforce the same? It's not just putting it in place, it's enforcing it, but would you put it in place, maybe increase it and enforce it?
One of the first things we did in the county when I came into office was invest in technology, because we were not unable to determine whether vendors and contractors had met their MBE, WB requirements until they submitted their final documents. And then, of course, it was too late to take corrective action, and you just fine them for not meeting their MBE, WB goals if that was the challenge. So we put information technology in place so we could get real-time reports on how the vendors were doing, so we could call them in and take corrective action. And we've gotten much better compliance as a result. I'm pleased to say that we've even been able, in the case of the renovation of the old Cook County Hospital, to get a private development team to agree to meet the county's MBE, WBE standards, even though there's no public dollars in the project.
Josie, you have a question or a point?
Yeah, I've been told that, her time is limited and she's going to have to leave. But what I want to say to you is, even with Bethel, we are putting something long-range in plan for accountability for whomever is elected. And we don't know whether it's going to be once a week, not once a week, but every 3 months or something, that we will say to whomever is mayor to come back, and we're going to hold you accountable for what you commit to doing. And we have you on tape, so be careful what you say when you come back, to be sure. But that's a part of Bethel, I think, is a part of initiating a program that's going to be ongoing so that we can hold candidates accountable for what they said. So she has exactly 5 more minutes, and I'm sorry.
Just let them ask questions.
So
when I was alderman, I tried to get out and to talk to as many of different parts of my constituency as possible, as frequently as they were interested in hearing from me. And I think that's what the mayor has to do as well.
Would you like to make some closing remarks?
Well, first of all, I'm very grateful to all of you for coming out today and to hear from our elders and our young people on this subject. Yeah, as Josie has said, the young people had some very good questions. So, I appreciate this opportunity to share my views of where Chicago needs to be going. We have to focus on helping our city grow and thrive, and provide opportunity for all of our people, so that everybody who lives in the city believes there's opportunity for themselves and their children. Otherwise, they'll leave. And that's one of the challenges we've had over the last decade, is continuing losses in population that I think reflect concerns about opportunity, concerns about the quality of our public schools, and concerns, of course, about the violence. And I've addressed several of those issues in my opening remarks. But thank you all for inviting me.
Let's give her a round of applause. We want to thank you, President Tony Pratt-Winkle, for being with us today. Bravo, and good luck.
As she leaves, I want to thank you, Tony, for being here. We invited all the candidates, and Ms. Pratt-Winkle showed up, and we want to thank her for coming here to speak. Can we give her another round of applause?
Okay, so here's a question for you. Why don't you all vote? Millenniums don't vote. Why don't you vote? It's not true?
Okay, the youth, exactly. The youth have lost hope. I'm from the west side of Chicago. Gladys and Kilpatrick, okay? I am from the west side of Chicago that I knew when there were more middle-class African-American families in the community. Right now, we live in a food desert, and we don't have access to capital. We don't even have a bank.
Is that why you don't vote, or is that why you should vote?
I'm explaining to you why you should vote.
But tell me
the
why.
conversation that I had with our young people standing on the blocks on Madison and Leamington, on Jackson and Costner, the same young people who said, I don't vote because my voice is not heard. It doesn't make a difference if I vote. They have the polling places rigged. This is what's coming from the mouths of young people. And we know for a fact that historically the polling places have been rigged. The feds came in. I'm not making this up. You can Google it. Until we change the leadership in Springfield, because this goes back to the Illinois Constitutional Convention of 1970, not just with Old Man Daley, but the son Daley, Ed Burke, and Michael Madigan. And that's the elephant in the room that nobody is talking about. When do we oust Michael Madigan from leadership? Then we don't have to worry about our black elected officials on the south side and west side continuing to rig the polling places and the systems. Because if you're not the committeeman, then guess what? You really don't have the power in the ward. As the alderman, you allocate the funds. But again, the reason why the young people tell me they don't vote, it doesn't benefit them. They're simply trying to feed themselves on a daily basis and dodge the bullet.
Okay, thank you very much.
No problem.
Now, we've been joined by Lori Lightfoot. Ms. Lightfoot, you want to have a seat there next to Mr. Montgomery?
Can I say something quick on that question? Real quick.
You got 1 minute.
I got 1 minute.
You got 1 minute.
So, one of the biggest, a couple things. So youth did vote November 6th. We gotta give millennials credit. We voted more than every age group November 6th.
Right.
Now, we didn't do as well in the primaries because we got to get the message out that primaries are not the last election, and I think that's one of the biggest things. Number two is that when politicians run campaigns, they neglect to talk to young people and get their opinion. And so millennials say, well, you don't talk to us, well then you don't need our vote. All right, so that was the type of campaign that I tried to run.
Okay, so we got hope, and we've got to speak directly to.
Speak to
as an answer. Okay, that's a good answer. Ms. Lightfoot, thank you very much for joining us, and happy St. Patrick's Day. So we're going to continue our conversation, and this is what we're doing. This is a town hall meeting, and the millenniums want to ask you questions. Y'all, let me tell you something. I got a problem with this millennium stuff. Look, everybody in here has been or is a millennium. Now, when I was a millennium, I did what folks told me to do. Jim Montgomery said, go get some coffee. I went and got the coffee. Jesse said, go do this. I did that. And consequently, you learn along the way. But this divide is just another way, in my very humble opinion, that we continue to divide ourselves. Okay, now having said that, I'm into the unity plan, okay?
There you go, amen.
I'm gonna start with coffee with your first question to Ms. Lightfoot. Lori, how much time we got?
I'm here.
You're here?
I'm here.
All right now, okay.
You may be careful with what you say. I know. I may retract that statement later.
All right, good afternoon, Ms. Lightfoot.
Good to see you, man.
So a question I posed earlier, and I want to pose to you as well, around economic development, and specifically getting young people, getting disenfranchised people, former people coming out of incarceration. Mm-hmm. Would you be in support of economic development that specifically focuses on not only training new entrepreneurs, but a plan to develop cooperative economics in black and brown communities where divestment, we just heard a beautiful speech from Tim talking about how TIF funding is being misused and misallocated specifically for downtown. So would you be looking to invest in these communities and create new opportunities for people that have been left out of the economy?
Of course. So, some of you know this, and I'm going to share the context for me and why this is so personal. The brother that's closest in age to me, and we were very close when we were young, spent most of his life locked up. And the last part was a 17-year sentence in federal prison. He's now a man in his early 60s, and with a high school degree, no real legitimate work history, and he struggles every single day. Now, he has probably 30 plus years locked up and in and out of somebody's jail. During that time, not surprisingly, he became estranged from our family. My father died while he was still locked up. So this issue is very, very personal to me, and we have thousands of mostly young men, but some women, who are coming back to Chicago and Cook County every single month with dire circumstances into neighborhoods who were no better able to help and support them than they were before they left. And if you look at the amount of money that the city of Chicago spends to support this population, it's next to nothing. So in neighborhoods, particularly on the west side, where this is really acute, if we do not invest in these folks and lower the barriers for them to re-enter the legitimate economy, we are going to continue to starve neighborhoods of valued resources, a valued workforce. So we have to be specific. I am the only candidate out of the 14 that ran, I think, maybe Jamal, that put out a substantive plan to help our returning citizens. It's something that I am fundamentally committed to, because we can't talk about economic development in neighborhoods without looking to this population. Now, I want to do more than help the folks who come back. I want to stop the pipeline. But as a start, we have to empower these folks to do something other than basic subsistence living, which is what the state and the city are allowing now. We have to change that.
Mr. Green, you want to take the next question, please?
So, thanks for coming, Ms. Lightfoot. So, as far as this week is of course No Cop Academy, of young people that are of course protesting, but they passed through the Cop Academy, they passed through Lincoln Yards. My question is on economic development again, but really in those buildings, those 38 buildings that are vacant, been sitting in our neighborhoods for so many years since he shut them down with no use for them. What are some plans that you have for those buildings or for economic development to come to our neighborhoods so that we can have economic engines?
Well, first of all, as you well know, the closing of those 50 schools did tremendous injury and damage and harm to the people in those communities, and they were mostly black and brown neighborhoods. What I think we have to do is, in looking at the 38 that are left, because they're still in black and brown neighborhoods, is engage with the community. Schools generally have to be community assets, but given that we've got now 38 schools that are still have not been repurposed, we need to go into the community, talk to the stakeholders, and then have a discussion about how we can invest in those properties to make them community assets. There are a lot of ideas that are floating out there, but I want to make sure that whatever we do, which wasn't done with the so-called Cop Academy, we start with a respectful conversation with people in the community about what they want and what they need. And then the city needs to be responsive to that and provide the resources. And maybe it's city-owned, maybe it's neighborhood resources plus city, maybe it's public-private partnership, but we have to turn those 38 buildings into something of value to the community rather than a painful reminder of how those schools were ripped out in the neighborhoods without being respectful of what the community's needs are.
Ms. Norwood, next question, please.
Okay. This would be a kind of lengthy question.
Sure.
So I'll try to speak as fast as I can.
If I could just ask you to get a little closer to the microphone.
I'm sorry. So my question is, when marijuana becomes legal in Chicago, Will you pardon all peoples in the county and expunge their records, but also distribute reparations for their time and the life that they missed being locked up? Also, will you help with building restorative programs to help integrate these peoples back into society? And how do you plan to make sure that the D-boys, black and brown men and women around Chicago who have been arrested and prosecuted involving distribution and intent to sell these drugs are given a chance and a seat at the table in this business that will be growing soon?
So that's a great question. I think there's a lot of different things that we need to say about that. I've been in frequent conversation with Representative Kelly Cassidy, who is the main sponsor of the marijuana legalization bill in the House of Representatives in the General Assembly. And what I've been urging her is some of the things that you pointed out in your question. Number one, we need to make sure that we learn the lessons, good and bad, from the states that have already legalized marijuana. Colorado's experience is very, very different than Oregon, and California is just now coming online. And Colorado moved too fast and didn't think about some of the implications of legalizing marijuana and how that was going to affect, frankly, people coming in from out of state, what that was going to mean if it's legal and now you're in a workplace where you're getting drug tested. So all of those things have to be thought through. The other thing that has to happen, and this is part of the conversation that's going on in Springfield now, is this one of the other parts of your question, which is we have a lot of people who have been locked up that are still incarcerated, a lot of people who were arrested and have those on a record for possession of marijuana. We have to make sure that we have a pathway to expunge those records and get those people out of jail. It doesn't make any sense if marijuana is legalized and these people then are going to carry that mark with them for the rest of their lives that's going to prevent them from having decent paying jobs. So that's got to be part of the state legislation so we get that done. The other thing that I've said, and I think this has to be true, and California probably is more advanced on this than any of the other states, we all know that black and brown communities have been ravaged by these kinds of arrests. We need to make sure that this new economy that is promising to spring up benefits our community, meaning there has to be ownership, meaningful ownership in these businesses that are going to be springing up, because in some instances this is a very lucrative business and we need to make sure that we're getting our fair share. The other thing I would say is, selfishly as a city, we need to make sure that when marijuana is taxed, we get that money too, that it doesn't go downstate and elsewhere. The reality is the majority of those businesses are going to be within Chicago and Cook County. We need to make sure that we get our fair share of those tax dollars. And then the last thing I'll say, which you didn't ask, but I think is part of this conversation as well, is we need to make sure that there's a dedicated revenue stream to help people who are suffering through addiction. That has to be part of the discussion as well.
So speaking of equal share, we see that Martha Stewart is getting into the marijuana business. I've heard that the Prisker family is getting into the marijuana business. Are we going to have affirmative action in the marijuana business?
Well, that's precisely what I said, which is there has to be ownership in black and brown communities. Now, when the casino gambling was first legalized here in our state, now probably 25, almost 30 years ago, there were things that were baked into the legislation to make sure that black and brown ownership happened. Now, as you know, that kind of slipped by the wayside. We can't afford to have that happen, and that is a point of emphasis for me. As I said, I'm in a couple-time weekly conversation with Kelly Cassidy as this thing moves through the General Assembly, and I want to make sure that we are treated fairly.
Good. Chantel Grant, next question, please.
Good evening, Ms. Lightfoot.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you as well. My question, again, is in economics. As you know, within the black community specifically on the south and west sides of Chicago have suffered tremendously with high taxes, vacant buildings, and not strong economic hubs. Considering there are strong economic hubs that needs to be invested in, what are your plans to do that as well? In particular, to young people and their skills, not ultimately with a degree. What do you plan on doing to strengthen and create wealth within the young people?
Well, that's a great question. And let me share with you kind of the context and framing for how I'm thinking about this. As J. Mal can attest, we probably went to 50 different community forums over the course of the last campaign. We had a community forum at Whitney Young High School, and one of the last questions that was asked was by a graduating senior. This person said to me, I'm graduating. I'm going off to school for 4 years. Tell me what you're going to do over the course of the next 4 years to entice me to come back to Chicago. I think that should be the central question of this campaign. What are we going to do to build hope and promise for our young people that they stay here and that if they're going off to school that they come back? And I think that's really at the heart of your question. I think we have to do a number of different things. And I want to pick up on the last point that you made, which I think is the right question. Some of you may be familiar with a program called Year Up, and it is a phenomenal program. And what it is it takes young people who probably haven't gone to college, maybe a little bit of community college, and it trains them on jobs that are available right now today. Jobs that are going to pay $40,000, $50,000, $60,000, and then it puts them in an internship and matches them up with employers. It's a phenomenal program. The guy that runs it is somebody that I work with in helping organize Christ the King College Prep High School on the West Side, really devoted to making sure that young people of color in particular have real ability to earn middle-class incomes. The only problem is it only serves a couple hundred people a year. So we need to think about programs like that, really invest in them and scale them up so that we are providing real hope and opportunity. We're living in a time where there are a lot of jobs, but the jobs aren't being matched up with the workforce. Another thing that I think we absolutely have to do is get rid of the kind of college or bust mentality within CPS. We need to make sure that we are bringing real good vocational training to every high school so that our kids can walk out of high school and get one of those good-paying middle-class jobs. You know, I've accumulated a lot of friends in the last 2 weeks, some of whom are in organized labor. And the thing that I've been saying to the trades in particular is, what is your plan right now today to make sure that black and brown young people get into the trades so they can also take advantage of those opportunities? And some of them I think do a decent job, but every avenue that we can to create a pipeline for our young people to get access to these good jobs is what we need to be doing. And I mentioned, and let me just say it again, about vocational education in high schools. I remember listening to National Public Radio probably about 3 or 4 years ago, and it was a story about a high school in Queens, New York. And what was going on there was airline mechanics from LaGuardia were going into those high schools and teaching kids how to be airline mechanics. They were literally bringing an airline engine into high schools and teaching these kids. They had internships during the summer. So by the time they graduated, they were really ready to walk into those good-paying jobs. Well, guess what, folks? We got 2 airports here. We have multiple airlines that make Chicago, whether it's Midway or O'Hare, their hub. Now that's just one example, but that's the kind of thing that we have to be creative about, creating opportunity for our folks. It's not about giving somebody a $15 an hour job. Now, I support the raise in the minimum wage, but you know as well as I do, minimum wage is not going to consistently put food on the table. You're going to have 2 and 3 times those kinds of jobs to be able to make it. I want to create jobs that people can live a lifetime on. They are here, but we need to open up those doors of opportunity to our people as well.
Ms. Winfrey?
Hi, Ms. Lightfoot.
How are you?
God bless you.
Good to see you again.
Pleasure. Thank you. I come from a community on the west side where nearly 1/3 of my peers are being incarcerated through the Illinois Department of Corrections. Nearly 1/3 of the Illinois Department of Corrections revenue comes from the Austin community for the entire state of Illinois. Now, when we talk about reentry, that's okay, but the fact that we don't have a housing committee at the state level concerns me, because once they re-enter, then what do we do with our people? So my concern is not just workforce training programs necessarily, where we understand that there are issues of mental illness, but again, like you said, if we offer resources to the community, will they participate? Well, full disclosure, I ran for city councilwoman in the 28th ward, and after speaking with my peers, yes, they're willing to work if we train them. One of the big problems is that many of our peers are not reading at the standard reading level, third grade, sixth grade reading level. I've worked in the schools. The point is, the workforce training programs and the trades programs have to be put on not just particularly on the west side of Chicago, the south side too, but again, when we talk about the rate of incarceration through the Illinois Department of Corrections, it's coming from the Austin community. What are you willing to do to change the rate of incarceration within our communities? Not just speaking to the $95 million COP Academy that we're all completely against, being that we have a $40 million command center at McPier in the North Building that could be utilized as a training facility for the police. What are you willing to do to ensure that our peers, our children, no longer go to jail at the rates that they're going, in bringing resources? The fact that we don't have adequate banks, we live in a food desert.
Well, I've actually been spending quite a bit of time on the west side in the last couple weeks in particular. And the thing that strikes me as I drive through the streets there's so little economic activity. It's churches, funeral homes, some gas stations, the occasional corner store, which, by the way, isn't owned by somebody who lives in that community, doesn't hire from that community. We cannot continue to leave the west side starving for resources. You know as well as I do, a lot of the crime that is taking place is crimes of poverty. People trying to feed themselves and take care of their families. So we have to have a clear investment strategy that is comprehensive. I would say, let's call it a Marshall Plan for the west side and the south side. Those areas that have 25% unemployment, where so many African American kids are living in poverty, where huge percentages of the neighborhoods are living on some form of government assistance. That cycle that keeps repeating itself without any kind of intervention on the part of government has to stop and change. So I'm committed to making sure that we don't end the investment with $95 million COP Academy. And by the way, it's going to be a lot more than that. Let's be honest. But coming to the community, engaging with community members, talking about the kinds of things that they need. For example, Lawndale Christian Center, they are very committed to making sure that they are investing in the neighborhood. But what I hear from them, particularly around affordable housing, which is one point that you touched upon, the city is the problem. The problem because there's too much red tape, the problem because the city gets involved in deals way too long and doesn't have the mentality in engaging with community-based developers to get to yes, meaning to facilitate the actual development rather than throwing roadblock after roadblock. We need to think about what's going on in our building codes so that we can have a lot more flexibility in the kind of housing that we're able to build. So the city hasn't led. We now have an opportunity because we have a brand new housing department. The housing department needs to be focused on cutting through the red tape and helping particularly community-based developers to develop affordable housing. Just to add a finer point on that. We are down, by conservative estimates, 120,000 units of affordable housing. If you look at our housing policy, on the last page we put up what's called a heat map. What that shows is that in 2/3 of the city, not a single unit of affordable housing has been built in the last 15 years. What's worse, I don't know if you all caught this. If you didn't, I urge you to look at it. About 2 weeks ago, the city's inspector general put out an audit a report on what's called these in lieu of fees. So what developers are able to do is they don't want to build affordable housing, they have to pay fees. Over the last 5 or 6 years, there's been literally hundreds of thousands of dollars that have been poured into in lieu of fees, and the city's supposed to be using that money to build affordable housing. So the sad reality is this: the city's Department of Planning, which owns responsibility for this, never set up a dedicated account into which those monies could go. So hundreds of millions of dollars they can't account for. What happened, of course, is it just got spent into the general revenue. And remember I said 120,000 affordable units down? The city has online, not built, but online, only 336 units. Now, something's fundamentally wrong with that, and we obviously have to change that. And we have very specific ways in which we can bring new development online that particularly accommodate families, so they're not studios and one-bedrooms. But we have to have somebody who cares about this, sees it, and is focused on making it happen, and I'm that person.
So just to follow up, would you be willing to pass an ordinance that ensures 50% of the residents on TIF development projects funded through our TIF dollars in each ward, 50% of the employees on those projects are residents of that ward?
Well, I think that there are already some things in place now that require that kind of neighborhood participation. They're just not enforced. So I'm happy to do everything I can to make sure that we, in any development where there's tax dollars, we maximize the number of people from that area that are actually working on those jobs. So for me, it's all about wealth creation. It has to be. And there's lots of different ways in which we can do that. Of course, employing people as carpenters and laborers and other workers on these projects is critically important, and we have to focus on making sure that we're giving opportunity for people in those neighborhoods. So I support that.
Forgive me, meaning would you ensure that the developer has an adequate workforce training program in place before they even place a bid on that project?
It would be, for me, it would be a requirement in the scope.
Okay.
Absolutely.
All right. So now, we're going to do some rapid fire. So what are your thoughts, Ms. Lightfoot, on elected school board?
I support it.
You support it?
I do.
Okay, and what are your thoughts on the Obama Library?
Well, look, I'm one who thought it should be in Washington Park, not Jackson Park. I think that ship has unfortunately sailed. But I also know that the minute the possibility of the presidential center coming here, land speculation went through the roof. And what that has meant is people who are living in these areas, and specifically now in Jackson Park, have seen this enormous escalation in property values, in rent, and in their property taxes. And as you know, there's a lawsuit that's pending to try to stop the center from being built in Jackson Park. If I'm mayor, I'm going to roll up my sleeves and get that resolved and make sure that residents in that neighborhood get the benefits that they're entitled to so that they're not displaced.
And would you, in that same vein, be supportive of community, help me, Tim, what is
Community benefits agreement. Yes,
Right.
that's what I'm saying.
Okay. Mayor Harold Washington had Economic Development Department, and the sole purpose of it, led by Mr. Wright, was to do that. Would you put such a department in place?
Well, what I want to do first is come up with a comprehensive plan for economic development. We have not had a land use plan in the city of Chicago which would drive the focus on economic development. We haven't had a land use plan in Chicago since 1966. 1966. So what happens, where it happens, is almost exclusively left up to the designs of developers. And we know what's happening. There's very little that's happening south of Roosevelt Road, and there's very little that's happening west of Ashland. Here is another opportunity where the city has to lead. So I will work with community members to put together a comprehensive economic development plan, and then of course, somebody has to run point on it. Because if you don't have somebody who's focused on this as their sole responsibility, it's not going to happen.
What are your thoughts on Lincoln Yards?
I've adamantly opposed it.
Good. You've talked about using the Civic Federation. How would Civic Federation work into Lightfoot government?
Well, the Civic Federation is obviously does a lot of good work in looking at the finances of the city. So there's a lot of different places that I think we need to go to listen and have input. I have a lot of respect for Lawrence Massal, who's the head of the Civic Federation. They just put out another report on the finances of the city and options for revenue. I'm not going to say I agree with everything that they put out, but they're, I think, an important source of information that we have to listen to.
So under a Lightfoot administration, what would we see from the city on affirmative action?
Well, I think you're going to see what I did when I was led the city's procurement department. We have to do a number of things. Number one, we have to make sure that in the $2 billion plus that the city spends every year in procuring goods and services, that those contracts are actually coming to Black and Brown folks. That has to happen. We need to make those contracts small enough so that small businesses don't have to go and say, "Mother, may I?" to a prime in order to get city business. And if we give them contracts, we got to pay them in a timely fashion. We can't, no small business can afford to go without payment for 60, 90, and 120 days, as happens way too frequently with city contracts. I think the other thing we have to do is this. Remember I mentioned $2 billion plus every single year. One thing that we are not doing is saying to those big contractors, what are you doing in your private sector work? Who are you hiring? The buzzword is called supplier diversity. We have to say to them, we believe that somebody who wants to do business with us has to demonstrate in all of their business that they are opening up doors of opportunity to women-owned, minority-owned, veterans-owned businesses and make that a priority. And I think just by calling the question, we're going to see more opportunity and more opportunity for building wealth. So we have to focus on that. The other thing that we have to do is, look, having helped run the procurement department and particularly the MBE, WEBE program, I know every trick in the book. And sadly, there are businesses that are certified, Black and Brown, who will sell their certification to the highest bidder. Rather than actually get the work and help build wealth, they'll just take a fraction of what they're entitled to in order to get some money coming in. We have to stop that. And I'm happy to make examples of people who sell themselves in that way. We have to have true minority businesses doing real work on real projects. And again, I know every trick and every game that can be played, and I'm going to make sure that the people who are responsible for doing certification and contract compliance understand the game and are watching out and putting in controls so the game can't be played. And if we need to make an example, folks, so be it.
I've got a question from the audience, lady back there.
Yes, ma'am.
You with your hand up, please.
I can't hear you.
You got to come up here. We can't hear.
We'll get your microphone.
This is about the return.
Step up.
Okay.
Away from the speaker.
Okay. The people returning back from prison.
Yeah.
We talked about affordable housing. Well, one of the main roadblocks to getting housing is that CHA, and a lot of these people come out of CHA housing situations because they have felonies, cannot go back.
Right.
Their family members are being actually kicked out of the Section 8 programs for even being associated with their relatives. So how can we, I guess it'll have to be a two-pronged kind of approach. The local government as well as the federal government to kind of break down some of that barrier that prohibits anyone from giving housing to these people.
Right. Well, look, there's a lot of things we need to do to shape up the CHA, right? They're sitting on all these housing vouchers. They're not taking care of senior buildings in the way that they need to, and that is obviously also a problem. And my understanding is that that's actually a CHEA rule, not a HUD rule. So we have to think about how we change that. That rule was put in place at the height of the crack epidemic. And it was so punitive that if you were a CHA resident and anybody connected with your household committed a crime, then you were at risk of being thrown out as well. So we need to solve that. Look, people can't reintegrate into society if they can't have a place to put their head at night. I understand that. So we have to fix that. We have to make sure that we get rid of the barriers to private renters as well, but I'm committed to making sure that we do that. Thank you.
Josie Childs, you want to, you had a question or comment?
First of all, I want to thank you for coming.
It's my pleasure.
I just want to say this, the Harold Washington Legacy Committee is interested in keeping his legacy alive. That cannot be done without involving our young people.
Right.
I hear from young people all the time, you want my vote, but you don't talk to me. And that's why I tried to put this together today. So I'm glad you were able to come. The questions have been very good. But I want to say to you the same thing that I said to the previous candidate who was here. We, along with Bethel Church, are putting together an accountability program.
Good.
So we are going to have you back if you're the lucky one. It may be 3 months, it may be every 3 months, and I tell everybody we have you on tape. So we will have you back.
Listen, I assume every time I'm out in public, I'm being taped.
So anyway, thank you for coming. I just wanted to say that. Thank you very much. But we do plan to try to do accountability session 2 or 3 a year, and we want you to come back to the community and see how you're doing.
Thank you. Let me, if I can, just add to that. J-Mall's candidacy, there was another young man that ran, really, I think, raised our consciousness about the necessity of talking to our young people. We don't have a fully baked plan, but I can assure you that we will have, if I'm lucky enough to be the next mayor, a specific focus and dedicated resources on how we best engage our young people at all levels. But I want to live true to the question that I talked about earlier. We have to make this city a place that our young people can afford, where they can have good paying jobs, and that they have pride in being from Chicago. And not just folks living in River North or South Loop or the West Loop, all over this neighborhood, all over the city. We need young people in our neighborhoods who are committed to being the future of our city because we provided the chance and the opportunity for them.
That's why I would imagine, I'm not sure, no one answered, but I would imagine that this is the only forum that you've gone to where you've had a panel of young people.
That's true.
Okay.
That's true.
So I see a couple of hands. Now I'm going to do 4 questions now. We got to consider this time, and I'm over time in doing it. So you all be brief and direct, please. Yes, ma'am. We will change the world.
Good afternoon.
Please take the microphone.
Good afternoon, family, brothers and sisters and brothers. And thank you again, Josie. Thank you for coming, Lori.
Good to see you.
I was almost a victim of condo conversion, but I fought and won out of court. Now we have new buyers that are coming in now and raising the rent $200 and $300 a whop on us. And so I'm a housing advocate. Would you be willing to release the monies that Daley and Rahm Emanuel have been sitting on, that CHA money, to build affordable housing in the black community on the land that's still vacant, some of it, that Tony Pretwinkle pushed the people out of Ivy Wells and 42nd and Lake Park, the 3 buildings, we used to call them the horseshoe buildings because they was like that, but they were blown down with dynamite. Second thing, our young people, I just want to know, can you bring programs for young people, preferably African Americans, back into Harold Washington College? I took 2 semesters of Spanish there last semester, semester before last. I'm telling you, Harold Washington College, and the majority of the students are not black, and not on the student government, and not in charge of hardly anything at that college. was a student at that college when Harold Washington was the mayor, and our children were there in high numbers. So can you bring programs back to Harold Washington College so the color of our children can reflect the name of our first black mayor?
There you go. The answer, of course, is yes, and as I said in answer to the previous question, the CHA has to be reformed from top to bottom. They can't sit on all these vouchers, sit on all this money, treat our seniors so shabbily. That has to fundamentally be changed, and I'm committed to doing that. Thank you.
Let me take one last question. I only got 3 minutes. I was on schedule, so let me take your question, and that's it, please.
Ms. Lightfoot, good to see you again, too. It is Harold Washington's legacy can be kept not only in this state, but nationally and internationally if we come together to produce the Harold Washington movie, The Greatest Good. Will you, if you're elected mayor, support the greatest good for the city of Chicago?
Well, look, I came to the city in 1986 at the height of Harold Washington's second election. And I remember so vividly how there was so much excitement and so much promise. He finally got control of city council. I think the aspirations and hope for so many people was so high, and then so soon thereafter, it was crushed with his untimely death. This is the first time since then that we've had real choice for mayor. And I am committed to doing everything we can to fulfill the legacy of Harold Washington. I know you have your movie. We've talked about it before. Certainly we'll have a further conversation. But I want to make sure that our children do not forget, that our children are energized by this incredible man and the movement that he sparked across this city. So I'm mindful of the fact that I'm standing here today because of the sacrifices of so many, and certainly because of the legacy of Harold Washington.
So on that note, let us all say thank you very much to Josie Childs and the Harold Washington Legacy Committee. Would you all please stand, let us know who you are, and say thank you so very much for putting this together.
I want them to know that there is a reception after this so we can mix and mingle and carry on this a little further.
Okay. Lori.
One thing I would like to ask, under Harold Washington's administration, he had a 25% set aside. That has completely evaporated. If we had that right now, we wouldn't have so many questions about economic development. Okay, we would be self-sustaining. Thank you.
Lori Lightfoot, thank you so very much for being with us. Thank you.
Thanks, All right, thanks again. Good to see you.